In the ancient pages of the Bible, among chronicles of kings, prophets, and heroes, there is a mysterious figure, Mephibosheth. Its name echoes through the centuries, but its history remains hidden, waiting to be revealed. Who was Mephibosheth? Why is your narrative shrouded in so many secrets? Today, we will reveal everything. And, of course, if you like this type of content, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with your friends. Let's explore this fascinating story together. To understand who Mephibosheth was and the importance of his story, we need to delve into the background in which his life took place. He is mentioned in the second book of Samuel, one of the most detailed historical works in the Old Testament, which narrates crucial events of the people of Israel. But Mephibosheth was not a prominent figure like a king, a prophet, or a military leader. His life, at first glance, seems to be just a footnote in the midst of great events. However, as you will see, it is in the details that this story gains strength and meaning. Mephibosheth was the grandson of the feared King Saul, Israel's first monarch, famous for his imposing stature and charismatic early leadership. He was also the son of Jonathan, one of the most noble and loyal characters in Scripture, who had a deep and sincere friendship with David, the future king. This placed Mephiboset in a prominent setting and direct connection with royalty. However, his destiny was marked by challenges that went far beyond his noble blood. After the death of Saul and Jonathan, Mephibosheth saw his family fall into disgrace. His physical condition also made him vulnerable. Since he was little, he had been burdened with a disability caused by an accident. His nurse, while rushing away during a battle, dropped him, resulting in permanent damage to his feet. This shaped society's perception of him and defined the way he saw himself, especially at a time when disability was often seen as a curse or weakness. Vulnerable, marginalized, and living far from the power that once belonged to his family, Mephibosheth seemed destined for oblivion. But history holds surprises. His seemingly insignificant life was transformed by an act of kindness and loyalty that would echo forever. To understand why Mephibosheth was sought after and elevated from a position of obscurity to a place of honor, we need to go back in time and explore the figure of his grandfather, King Saul, and the impact of his reign on David's rise. Let us now revisit the beginnings of this historic rivalry and the promises that would pave the way for Mephibosheth's redemption. Saul's reign marked the beginning of monarchy in Israel, a significant transition for the people who, until then, had been led by judges and prophets under the direct guidance of God. Saul was chosen by God and anointed by the prophet Samuel as the first king of Israel. He was the portrait of an ideal leader by human standards, tall, strong, and imposing in appearance. Initially, Saul demonstrated bravery and military leadership, leading Israel to important victories against its enemies. However, Saul's reign was marked by a series of disobediences to divine orders. On several occasions, he failed to comply with God's instructions, placing his own will above divine designs. One of the most emblematic episodes was his refusal to completely destroy the Amalekites, disobeying a direct order from God given by Samuel. This act was the beginning of his downfall. From then on, Saul lost divine favor, and God determined that another would be chosen to occupy the throne of Israel. This other was David, a young shepherd from Bethlehem, known for his courage, faith, and sincere heart. The anointing of David as future king, carried out secretly by the prophet Samuel, symbolized a new direction for Israel. God chose David not for his appearance or physical strength, but for his heart willing to obey and serve faithfully. The relationship between Saul and David began on a positive note. David was summoned to the palace to play the harp and alleviate the spiritual torments that afflicted Saul. He also distinguished himself by defeating the giant Goliath, earning fame as a national hero. But Saul's initial admiration for David soon turned to jealousy and paranoia, especially after the people began to acclaim David more enthusiastically than the king himself. Afraid of losing the throne, Saul began to pursue David, determined to eliminate him as a threat. For years, David lived as a fugitive, fleeing from Saul's wrath, but always refusing to raise his hand against the king, even when he had the opportunity. This conflict between Saul and David is one of the most dramatic and human narratives in the Bible, marked by jealousy, fear, and unshakable faith. While Saul headed towards a tragic end, David rose to prominence as the future leader of Israel. The contrast between the two was evident. While Saul clung to power and his own will, David trusted God and sought to follow his ways. This transition of power was not only political, but spiritual, symbolizing the transition from a reign based on human strength to a government aligned with divine purposes. Amid all the political and emotional turmoil between Saul and David, one of the most inspiring and moving relationships in the Bible emerges. The friendship between Jonathan, Saul's son, and David, the future king of Israel. At first glance, it would be logical to imagine that the two would be natural rivals, since David was destined to assume the throne that, by hereditary right, could have belonged to Jonathan. However, what happened between them was the opposite of that. Jonathan recognized something special in David. He saw in him not only a courageous warrior and a natural leader, but also the man chosen by God to rule Israel. Despite being the king's son and heir apparent, Jonathan demonstrated a rare humility and greatness of spirit, placing God's will above his own interests. He and David formed a deep bond based on mutual respect, trust, and a brotherly love that transcended circumstances. The friendship between the two was formalized through a pact. This was not just an agreement of personal loyalty, but a sacred covenant made before God. Jonathan promised to protect David against the wrath of his father, Saul, and David, in turn, vowed to care for Jonathan's seed in the future, no matter what. This pact is a testament to unwavering loyalty, even in a scenario of betrayals, wars, and family tensions. Jonathan's commitment went beyond words. On several occasions, he risked his own life to protect David from Saul's murderous intentions. He mediated conflicts, helped David escape traps, and at all times remained faithful to his friend. His loyalty was not an act of rebellion against his father, but a demonstration of his conviction that David was God's chosen one. On the other hand, David never used his friendship with Jonathan to usurp the throne or harm Saul. He deeply respected the royal lineage and refused to raise a hand against the king, even under relentless persecution. This mutual respect between David and Jonathan is an example of how true friendship can withstand extreme circumstances and the weight of conflicting responsibilities and loyalties. Unfortunately, the pact between David and Jonathan would be tragically tested. During a battle against the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, Saul and his sons, including Jonathan, were killed. Saul, realizing that defeat was inevitable, took his own life to avoid capture. Jonathan, in turn, died in combat, fighting alongside his father. Jonathan's death was a devastating blow to David, who deeply mourned the loss of his friend. However, even in the midst of pain, David remained faithful to the covenant he had made. Years later, as king of Israel, he would remember the promise and take measures to honor it, ensuring the protection and care of Jonathan's descendants. With the deaths of Jonathan and Saul, their family line seemed doomed to oblivion. But the covenant between David and Jonathan was still alive. David, now king, begins a search to find a descendant of his dear friend. It is at this moment that Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, enters the scene. Let's discover how Mephibosheth's life was transformed by King David's grace and loyalty. After the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, David assumed the throne of Israel and began to consolidate his reign. Although he was busy with political issues, battles, and the unification of the tribes of Israel, David never forgot the promise he had made to his friend Jonathan. He had sworn to care for his offspring, and that promise still echoed in his heart. even many years later. One day, David asked his servants, "Is there still anyone left from the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" 2 Samuel 9 verse 1. This question, although simple, carries deep emotional and spiritual weight. David was not seeking revenge against Saul's family, as would be common at the time, when new kings eliminated heirs to the previous throne to avoid rebellions. On the contrary, David was determined to demonstrate kindness and loyalty by honoring the covenant he had made with Jonathan. It was then that a servant named Ziba, who had served in the house of Saul, informed David that there was one survivor, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan. But there was something that made this discovery even more intriguing. Mephibosheth was not only the rightful heir to Saul's lineage, he was also a man who carried a mark of vulnerability. Since childhood, Mefiboset was unable to walk due to a tragic accident. During his nurse's escape after the deaths of Saul and Jonathan, the boy was dropped, which resulted in a permanent disability in his feet. Mephibosheth lived in Lo-debar, an isolated and poor region, far from the center of power in Jerusalem. Lo-debar, whose name means without pasture or without a word, was a desolate place that symbolized oblivion and marginalization. It is likely that he was there to hide, fearing reprisals because he was a direct descendant of the house of Saul. At that time, it was common for new kings to eliminate surviving members of the previous dynasty, and Mephibosheth knew that his position made him a potential target. Imagine the scene. Mephibosheth, living in seclusion, probably feeling abandoned and forgotten, receives news that King David is calling him to appear at the palace. What must he have thought? Fear? Insecurity? Perhaps he believed he was being summoned to his execution, as was the custom of the time. But instead, David had completely different plans. When Mephibosheth was brought before David, he fell down in reverence, calling himself servo and demonstrating humility before the king. But David surprised him with words of grace and kindness. "Do not be afraid, for I will certainly be kind to you for Jonathan your father's sake. I will restore to you all the lands of your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat bread at my table." 2 Samuel 9 verse 7. This statement from David is powerful for several reasons. First, he not only spared Mephibosheth's life, but also restored his lands and wealth, ensuring his safety and stability. Second, by inviting him to eat at the royal table, David was doing something even more significant. Eating at the king's table was not just a gesture of hospitality. It was a symbol of inclusion, honor, and equality. David was treating Mephibosheth not as an enemy or a foreigner, but as a member of the royal family. Furthermore, the royal table represented a place where Mephibosheth's physical disability would not be visible. Sitting at the table, he was just like everyone else. This gesture by David showed that, instead of focusing on Mephibosheth's limitations, he chose to see the value and dignity he possessed as a human being and as a descendant of Jonathan. David's encounter with Mephibosheth is one of the most touching stories in the Old Testament, full of symbolism and meanings that transcend time. After being called to the palace, Mephiboset, who lived a life of seclusion in Lo-debar, saw his existence completely change in a single gesture of grace and kindness. What could have been a moment of judgment became a living example of loyalty, forgiveness, and redemption. First, David's decision to spare and bless Mephibosheth was revolutionary for the time. In ancient culture, especially in the Middle East, the accession of a new king often meant the end of the previous ruler's lineage. This was done to avoid power struggles and future revolts. However, David not only spared Mephibosheth's life, but went further by restoring all of his grandfather Saul's lands, giving him back the inheritance that seemed lost forever. With this, David ensured that Mephibosheth and his family had financial security and stability. But David didn't stop there. He also ordered Mephibosheth to eat at his table every day. At that time, sitting at the king's table was a privilege reserved only for the most intimate members of the royal family and highly esteemed guests. By offering this invitation to Mephibosheth, David was including him in his own family, giving him a place of honor and dignity. This symbolized not only the restoration of their social position, but also the overcoming of their condition of vulnerability and marginalization. The name Mephiboset has a deep meaning, which directly connects to its history. In Hebrew, his name can be translated as he who removes shame or what is freed from shame. This interpretation becomes even more powerful when we consider that Mephibosheth carried with him not only the physical limitations resulting from his disability, but also the symbolic weight of belonging to a house that had fallen from grace. By restoring Mephibosheth's dignity, David not only fulfilled his covenant with Jonathan, but also gave him a new identity, aligned with the meaning of his name. The story of Mephibosheth is, above all, a narrative about grace. Grace is an undeserved favor, a gesture of kindness that does not depend on the actions or merits of the person receiving it. Mephibosheth, in his own words, saw himself as a dead dog, 2 Samuel 9 verse 8, an expression that reflected how he perceived himself: insignificant, vulnerable, and unwanted. But David saw beyond that. He saw Mephibosheth not as a man marked by his limitations or his family's past, but as the son of Jonathan, someone worthy of love and care. This act of grace reminds us that our limitations, pasts, or weaknesses do not determine our worth. Just as Mephibosheth was welcomed by David, we are invited to reflect on how kindness and mercy can transform lives. In addition to grace, David's attitude is also a notable example of loyalty. Even after Jonathan's death, David remained faithful to the covenant he had made with him. The care shown to Mephibosheth was not only a moral obligation, but a tribute to the love and friendship that David had shared with Jonathan. This shows us the power of a promise kept, even in the midst of challenging circumstances. David could have chosen to forget the covenant, especially in a time when politics and survival often spoke louder than morality. But he honored his word, demonstrating that bonds of friendship and true loyalty can transcend even the barriers of time and death. David's invitation for Mephibosheth to eat daily at his table carries even deeper symbolism. In that society, a physical disability often meant marginalization. People with limitations were seen as less valuable and were often excluded from public life. But by including Mephibosheth at his table, David was publicly declaring that he was worthy, loved, and accepted. More than that, the king's table was a place of equality. Sitting alongside other important figures in the kingdom, Mephibosheth was on equal footing with everyone, and his disability was no longer the focus. This inclusion symbolized that he was part of something bigger, the royal family. The story of Mephibosheth goes far beyond a simple biblical account. It is a narrative full of symbolism and lessons that transcend time, touching our hearts and challenging us to reflect on universal themes such as grace, loyalty, forgiveness, and dignity. In an age marked by exclusion and the relentless pursuit of power, David's gesture toward Mephibosheth presents us with a model of compassion that continues to inspire generations. Mephibosheth did nothing to earn David's favor. On the contrary, he was, in political and social terms, a potential rival, a descendant of the house of Saul who could be seen as a threat to David's kingship. But grace is exactly that, an undeserved gift, an act of kindness that transcends human merit or logic. David saw in Mephibosheth not just a vulnerable man, but someone who was worthy of being restored because of a promise of friendship and faithfulness. This lesson is deeply relevant to us today. How often do we judge people by what they have done, what they have, or the circumstances they were born into? The story of Mephibosheth reminds us that everyone carries intrinsic value, regardless of their position or limitations. Just as David restored Mephibosheth, we are called to act with grace, seeing beyond appearances and offering opportunities for redemption and inclusion. Another striking aspect of this story is David's fidelity to the pact he had made with Jonathan. Even after so many years, and despite drastic changes in circumstances, David remained true to his word. He could have ignored the pact, especially considering that Jonathan was no longer alive to fulfill this promise. However, David chose to honor his word, demonstrating that true loyalty does not depend on convenience or external pressure. This challenges us to reflect on the value of our own promises. We live in a world where commitments are often discarded when they become inconvenient. But the story of David and Mephibosheth teaches us that keeping our words, even when there is no one to hold us accountable, is an act of integrity that can transform lives. By bringing Mephibosheth to his table, David not only demonstrated compassion, but also a sense of inclusive justice. In society at that time, people with disabilities were often marginalized and considered inferior. But David broke with this logic, ensuring that Mephibosheth was not only cared for, but included in a place of honor. Sitting at the king's table, Mephibosheth was treated as an equal, with the same respect and dignity as any other member of the court. This gesture is a powerful message for today. In a world that still faces challenges related to inclusion, Mephiboset's story reminds us that true leadership is not just about caring, but about integrating. Inclusion is not a favor, but a right, and everyone has a seat at the table, regardless of their limitations or background. If this story touched you, leave your comment below. I want to know what you thought and what lessons you learned from this narrative. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this video with other people who need to hear this message. And tell us, what theme would you like to see in our next videos? Together, we can continue exploring stories like this, full of meaning and inspiration. A big hug, stay with God, and see you in the next video.